Marcus Thompson stood 7 feet 2 inches tall, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow entire rooms. Children would cross the street when they saw him coming, their parents pulling them closer with worried whispers. What they didn't know was that this giant of a man spent his nights lying awake, haunted not by the monsters under beds, but by the monsters he had become in distant lands where the sand tasted of blood and the air reeked of gunpowder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Marcus killed a man, he was 22 years old and stationed outside Kandahar. The morning had started like any other, checking equipment, reviewing patrol routes, joking with Rodriguez about his girlfriend back in Phoenix. By sunset, 3 families would receive visits from officers in dress uniforms, and Marcus would discover that taking a life changes something fundamental in your soul, something that can never be unchanged. His hands were steady that day. Had been trained to be steady, conditioned through countless hours at shooting ranges and combat simulations. When the insurgent appeared around the corner of a crumbling building, AK-47 raised and finger on the trigger, Marcus's muscle memory took over. 2 shots, center mass. The man crumpled like a discarded newspaper in the wind. "Good shot, Thompson," Sergeant Williams had said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You saved Rodriguez's life." Marcus nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He stared at the figure lying motionless in the dust, noting absently how young the man looked, how his sandals were worn thin from walking, how his left hand wore a simple gold wedding band that caught the desert sun like a tiny flame. That night, Marcus wrote a letter to his mother in Bakersfield, California. He told her about the weather, about the food, about how Rodriguez had received a care package with homemade cookies that tasted like heaven after weeks of MREs. He didn't tell her about the wedding ring or how the dead man's eyes had reminded him of his younger brother Danny, or how he had thrown up behind the supply tent until his stomach was empty and his ribs ached. The second kill came 3 months later during a night raid. This time it was a teenager, maybe 17, clutching a rusty pistol with shaking hands. Marcus saw the fear in the boy's eyes, saw how his finger trembled on the trigger, saw how he whispered what sounded like a prayer in Pashto. The boy's shot went wide, embedding itself in a concrete wall. Marcus's didn't dot by his 4th deployment. Marcus had stopped counting. The faces blurred together in his memory, some young, some old, some terrified, some defiant. Each one added another layer of callous to his conscience, another brick in the wall he was building around his heart. His squad mates called him the Tower, not just for his height, but for his steadiness under fire, his ability to make the hard calls when chaos erupted around them. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had been different from the other officers Marcus had served under. She stood barely 5 feet 4 inches, her slight frame almost comical next to his massive one, but she commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. During their first mission together, when Marcus hesitated for a split second before engaging a target, she had pulled him aside afterward. "What's on your mind, Thompson?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her rank through merit rather than politics. Marcus had learned not to show weakness, not to admit to the dreams that woke him up screaming, not to mention how he sometimes saw the faces of the dead in his coffee cup or in the patterns of clouds overhead. "Nothing, ma'am. Just making sure of the target." Chun studied his face with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see through his carefully constructed walls. "You know what the difference is between a good soldier and a broken one, Thompson?" "No, ma'am." "A good soldier remembers that every trigger pull matters. A broken soldier either stops caring or cares too much to function. The key is finding the balance, doing the job while keeping your humanity intact." But Marcus wasn't sure he had any humanity left to keep intact. By his 6th deployment, he had become a machine of controlled violence, a weapon wielded by distant politicians who had never felt the weight of a rifle or smelled cordite burning in the desert air. He was promoted to staff sergeant, given more responsibility, more men to lead into situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home whole or coming home in pieces. The mission that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in March, during what was supposed to be a routine patrol through the outskirts of Helmand province. Intelligence had indicated possible Taliban movement in the area, but the morning had been quiet, almost peaceful. The local children had even waved at their convoy from doorways, their small faces lighting up when Rodriguez tossed them pieces of candy from his dwindling supply. The IED that destroyed their lead vehicle was buried beneath 6 inches of sand and triggered by a cell phone from a building 300 meters away. Marcus watched Corporal Jenkins, a kid from Vermont who collected postcards and dreamed of becoming a teacher, disappear in a cloud of smoke and flame that rose toward the sky like a malevolent flower, blooming in fast motion. The firefight that followed lasted 4 hours. Marcus and his remaining men took cover behind a low stone wall that had once been part of someone's home, its rooms now open to the sky and filled with rubble that crunched under their boots like broken teeth. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves well, using the terrain and abandoned buildings to create a deadly crossfire that pinned the Americans down while slowly picking them off. Marcus lost 3 more men that day: Patterson, who had been planning to propose to his girlfriend; Kowalski, who sent half his paycheck home to his elderly parents in Detroit; and Martinez, who could make anyone laugh even in the darkest moments of their deployment. Each death carved another piece from Marcus's soul until he felt hollow inside, like a giant bell that could only produce empty, ringing sounds when struck. When the backup finally arrived and the shooting stopped, Marcus found himself standing over the body of a Taliban fighter he had killed with his sidearm at close range. The man couldn't have been older than 25, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work and a face that reminded Marcus of his college roommate. In the fighter's shirt pocket, Marcus found a photograph of a young woman holding a baby, both of them smiling at the camera with the kind of pure joy that exists before the world teaches you to be afraid. That photograph stayed with Marcus through his final months of deployment, a constant reminder that every enemy had been someone's son, someone's father, someone's hope for the future. He carried it back to California when his tour ended, back to a country that thanked him for his service with parades and yellow ribbon magnets but couldn't understand the weight of the ghosts he brought home with him. The transition to civilian life was like trying to learn a new language after spending years speaking only in violence and survival. Marcus rented a small apartment in Sacramento, far enough from his family that they wouldn't see him on the bad days when the nightmares followed him into daylight and the sound of car engines backfiring sent him diving behind furniture. He took a job at a construction site where his size and strength were assets and where the constant noise of machinery helped drown out the voices in his head. But the children were the hardest part. Walking through the city, Marcus would see kids playing in parks, their laughter echoing off playground equipment like music from a world he could no longer fully inhabit. Their innocence reminded him of what he had been before the war. He learned that survival sometimes requires becoming the very thing you once feared. When children looked at him with wide, curious eyes, he saw not wonder but wariness, as if they could sense the darkness he carried inside him like a tumor that had grown too large to remove. The nightmares came every night without fail. Sometimes he was back in Afghanistan, watching Jenkins disappear in smoke and flame. Sometimes he was standing over bodies in the sand, counting wedding rings and family photographs. But the worst dreams were the ones where he was home, where he was walking through familiar streets in Bakersfield, and every face he passed was someone he had killed, their eyes following him with questions he could never answer. Marcus started drinking, not to get drunk, but to blur the edges of memory enough that sleep might come without visitors. He kept the apartment clean and sparse, like a barracks room, because clutter reminded him of the chaos of battle and empty spaces felt safer than full ones. He avoided crowds, avoided loud noises, avoided anything that might trigger the reflexes that had kept him alive overseas, but had no place in a world of shopping malls and coffee shops and people who complained about traffic jams as if they were life or death situations. The isolation was complete and self-imposed. Marcus told himself he was protecting others from what he had become, but the truth was simpler and more painful. He was protecting himself from their judgment, from their inability to understand, from their well-meaning questions about his service that he could never answer honestly without destroying something pure in their worldview. One evening, as autumn painted the Sacramento sky in shades of orange and gold, Marcus was walking home from work when he heard the sound that would change his life forever. It started as a whimper, then grew into a cry of genuine terror, a child's voice calling for help from an alley between two office buildings. Every instinct told Marcus to keep walking, to mind his own business, to avoid complications that might draw attention or require explanations. But his feet betrayed him, carrying him toward the sound despite his mind's protests. What he found in that alley would haunt him in an entirely different way than the memories of war. A little girl, number more than 8 years old, was pressed against a brick wall while a man in a dirty coat reached for her with hands that promised nothing but harm. The child's school backpack lay scattered on the ground, its contents spilled across cracked asphalt like the remnants of innocence interrupted. For a moment that lasted forever, Marcus stood frozen at the alley's mouth, caught between the soldier he had been and the man he was trying to become. The familiar weight of decision pressed down on his shoulders. To act meant returning to violence. To hesitate meant failing someone who couldn't protect themselves. In that suspended second, he understood that some choices define not just what you do, but who you are willing to become. The man in the dirty coat never saw Marcus coming. One moment he was reaching for the terrified girl, and the next he was airborne, his body connecting with the opposite wall of the alley with a sound like a bag of cement hitting concrete. Marcus hadn't meant to throw him quite so hard, but years of suppressed rage and protective instinct had combined into something he couldn't fully control. The predator crumpled to the ground, unconscious but breathing. Marcus stood over him, fists clenched, every muscle in his massive frame coiled and ready for more violence. The familiar rush of combat adrenaline flooded his system, the heightened awareness, the slowed perception of time, the clarity that came with decisive action. For the first time since returning home, Marcus felt like himself again. "Are you hurt?" he asked the little girl, his voice gentler than anyone who knew his reputation would have believed possible. She shook her head, tears streaming down dirt-stained cheeks, her dark hair falling across her face in tangled strands. She couldn't have been more than 8, with gap-toothed smile hidden behind terror and eyes that held an intelligence beyond her years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Marcus knelt down, making himself smaller despite the impossibility of truly diminishing his presence. The girl studied his face with the careful assessment children use when determining if an adult can be trusted. "Emma Rodriguez," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant traffic sounds filtering into the alley. "My mom works in that building." She pointed toward one of the office structures that formed the alley's walls. Marcus helped Emma gather her scattered school supplies, crayons, a notebook decorated with unicorn stickers, a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in foil. As he handed her the backpack, their eyes met, and something passed between them that neither could have articulated. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The child saw past his intimidating exterior to something worth trusting, while Marcus glimpsed at innocence he had forgotten could still exist in the world. "Let's get you back to your mom," Marcus said, offering his hand. Emma took it without hesitation, her small fingers disappearing into his calloused palm. Like a bird seeking shelter in the branches of an ancient tree, they found Maria Rodriguez on the 3rd floor of the Westfield Insurance Building, frantically calling schools and police stations while her coworkers gathered around her desk in supportive clusters. When the elevator doors opened to reveal her daughter holding hands with a giant stranger, Maria's relief transformed instantly into protective suspicion. "Emma, where have you been?" "I was terrified." She swept her daughter into her arms before turning sharp eyes toward Marcus. "Who are you? What happened?" Marcus explained the situation with military brevity, leaving out the more violent details while emphasizing Emma's safety and quick thinking. Maria listened with the intensity of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately, a skill developed through years of working in insurance claims, where the difference between truth and fabrication could cost thousands of dollars. "You probably saved her life," Maria said finally, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to control. "How can I ever thank you?" The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with implications Marcus wasn't ready to explore. He mumbled something about being in the right place at the right time, about anyone would have done the same thing, about how he needed to get going. But as he turned to leave, Emma's voice stopped him. "Will I see you again, Mr. Marcus?" The simple question cracked something open in Marcus's chest, a fissure in the armor he had spent years constructing around his heart. He looked down at this small person who had shown him more trust in 10 minutes than most adults offered in months of acquaintance. "I don't know, Emma. Maybe." "I hope so," she said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "You're like a superhero, but real." Marcus left the building with Emma's words echoing in his mind and Maria's business card in his pocket. She had pressed it into his hand with instructions to call if he ever needed anything at all. Walking through the Sacramento twilight, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since before his first deployment, the possibility that he might be more than the sum of his worst moments. The next few weeks passed differently than the monotonous routine Marcus had established since returning home. The nightmares still came, the faces of the dead still visited his dreams, but they were joined now by other images: Emma's smile when he had returned her backpack, Maria's tears of relief, the moment when a frightened child had chosen to trust him despite every reason to be afraid. Marcus found himself walking past the insurance building on his way home from work, not stopping but glancing toward the 3rd floor windows where he sometimes caught glimpses of Maria moving between desks and file cabinets. He told himself he was just making sure Emma got home safely from school, that his protective instincts were simply ensuring no other predators lurked in the area. But the truth was more complicated and more frightening than he was ready to admit. 3 weeks after the alley incident, Marcus was buying groceries at the Safeway on J Street when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. Emma Rodriguez stood in the cereal aisle beside a shopping cart, waving at him with the enthusiasm children reserve for unexpected encounters with people they consider friends. "Mom, it's Mr. Marcus," Emma announced, tugging on Maria's jacket sleeve, "the one who helped me." Maria looked up from her shopping list, surprise registering on her features before transforming into something warmer. She was prettier than Marcus remembered, with laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of someone who had found reasons for joy despite life's complications. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore scrubs that identified her as a medical professional, information that contradicted Marcus's memory of finding her at the insurance office. "Marcus, I was hoping we'd run into you again," Maria said, genuine warmth in her voice. "I wanted to thank you properly, maybe buy you dinner or coffee." Emma hasn't stopped talking about her giant guardian angel. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, unaccustomed to praise that didn't come with military ribbons or commendations. "You don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Maria said firmly, "they wouldn't have. And that's exactly why I want to thank you." Emma had wandered over to examine his shopping cart with the unashamed curiosity of childhood. "You eat a lot of frozen dinners," she observed. "Don't you cook?" The question was innocent enough, but it highlighted the emptiness of Marcus's existence in a way that made him uncomfortable. His cart contained the standard bachelor fare microwave meals, instant coffee, beer, and basic necessities, purchased without thought or care for nutrition or pleasure. "I'm not much of a cook," Marcus admitted. "Mom makes the best enchiladas." "In Sacramento," Emma announced with absolute confidence. "She could teach you." "Emma," Maria said gently, "Mr. Marcus probably has other plans." But Marcus found himself looking into Emma's hopeful eyes and feeling something crack open in his chest again, wider this time. "I don't actually have other plans, I mean." The invitation came naturally, as if Maria had been planning to extend it all along. Sunday dinner at their house, nothing fancy, just a chance for Emma to properly introduce her hero to her extended family and for Maria to express her gratitude in a more meaningful way than words alone could convey. Marcus spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation he hadn't experienced since his first combat deployment. He bought new clothes, got his first haircut in months, and even attempted to trim his beard into something less intimidating. Standing in front of his bathroom mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him, still enormous, still scarred by experiences that showed in his eyes, but somehow softer around the edges. The Rodriguez house sat in a working-class neighborhood of Sacramento, its small front yard meticulously maintained and decorated with colorful flowers that defied the late autumn weather. Wind chimes hung from the porch, creating gentle music that reminded Marcus of better times, of a world where beauty existed for its own sake rather than as a luxury to be defended with violence. Emma answered the door wearing a dress covered in dinosaur patterns, her hair braided with ribbons that matched the flowers in the yard. Behind her, Marcus could hear the sounds of a family gathering, multiple conversations, laughter, children playing, the kind of domestic symphony he had almost forgotten existed. "Mr. Marcus." Emma threw her arms around his legs in a hug that nearly knocked him off balance. "You came. Mom said you might not, but I knew you would." The living room was crowded with people, Maria's extended family, neighbors, friends from work. Marcus was introduced to aunts and uncles and cousins, to Emma's grandmother who spoke primarily in Spanish, but whose eyes conveyed welcome more effectively than words, to a dozen children who stared at his height with undisguised fascination, before accepting his presence with the adaptability unique to the young. Dinner was served family-style around a table that had been expanded with card tables and folding chairs to accommodate the crowd. Marcus found himself seated between Emma and her teenage cousin Diego, who peppered him with questions about the military while serving him portions of food that could have fed a normal-sized person for days. The enchiladas were indeed exceptional, but what struck Marcus more profoundly was the atmosphere surrounding the meal. These people had invited a stranger into their home, shared their food and their stories, included him in their conversations and their laughter without agenda or expectation. It was generosity on a scale Marcus had forgotten existed outside of military units bonded by shared danger. After dinner, while the adults cleaned up and the older children played video games in the basement, Emma led Marcus to her room to show him her drawings. The walls were covered with artwork depicting families and animals and fantastical creatures, all rendered with the bold confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned to doubt her own creativity. "This one's my favorite," Emma said, pointing to a drawing of a very tall man standing next to a much smaller girl. Both figures were smiling, and the man's hands were positioned protectively around the child without touching her. "It's you and me in the alley, but I made us happy instead of scared." Marcus stared at the drawing, seeing himself through Emma's eyes, not as a weapon or a killer or a broken veteran, but as a protector, someone worthy of trust and affection. The child had drawn him with careful attention to detail: his height, His build, even the scar above his left eyebrow that he'd gotten in Kandahar. But she had also drawn him smiling, his posture relaxed rather than tense, his eyes kind rather than haunted. "Can I keep this?" Marcus asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Of course. I made it for you anyway." Emma beamed with the pleasure of someone whose gift has been truly appreciated. "Will you come back for Thanksgiving? Mom said we could invite you if you don't have other plans." The question hung in the air like a bridge spanning the gap between Marcus's old life and something new, something he had never dared to imagine for himself. Looking at this child who saw goodness in him despite all evidence to the contrary, Marcus felt the final walls around his heart beginning to crumble. "I'd like that very much, Emma." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus found himself helping Maria wash dishes while Emma fell asleep on the couch, exhausted by the excitement of the day. Working side by side in comfortable silence, Marcus was struck by how natural it felt, how easily he fit into the rhythm of domestic life despite years of believing he was too broken for such simple pleasures. "She's gotten attached to you," Maria said softly, nodding toward her sleeping daughter. "I hope that's okay." Marcus dried a plate with unnecessary care, buying time to find the right words. "She's an incredible kid. You've raised her well." "It hasn't been easy. Her father left when she was 3, said he wasn't ready for the responsibility. I've been worried about her not having positive male influences in her life." The admission hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to fully explore. Marcus understood that Maria was offering him something precious, not just her gratitude, but her trust, her willingness to let him become part of her daughter's world despite knowing almost nothing about his past. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," Marcus said honestly. "I've done things. I'm not the man you think I am." Maria turned to face him fully, studying his expression with the same intensity she had shown that first day in her office. "Emma has good instincts about people. If she trusts you, that's enough for me. Whatever you've done before, whoever you were, that's the past. What matters is who you choose to be now." Walking home through the Sacramento night, Emma's drawing tucked carefully in his jacket pocket, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a soldier trying to survive another deployment, but the quiet hope of someone discovering that redemption might be possible, that the story of his life didn't have to end with the chapters written in blood and sand. Nightmares still came that night, but for the first time in years, they were interrupted by other dreams, images of laughter around a dinner table, of a little girl's trusting smile, of hands that had learned to protect instead of destroy. When Marcus woke the next morning, the faces of the dead were still there, but they seemed somehow less demanding, as if even ghosts could recognize the possibility of atonement. The construction site accident happened on a Tuesday morning in November, 2 weeks after Marcus had shared Thanksgiving dinner with the Rodriguez family. A crane cable snapped under the weight of a steel beam, sending 2 tons of metal swinging toward a group of workers who had nowhere to run. Marcus saw it happening in slow motion, the same heightened awareness that had kept him alive in Afghanistan now kicked in as he calculated trajectories and reaction times with mathematical precision. Without thinking, Marcus launched himself toward the danger zone, his massive frame colliding with 3 workers and carrying them out of the beam's path, just as it crashed into the ground where they had been standing. The impact sent concrete shards flying like shrapnel, and Marcus instinctively covered the men beneath him with his own body, feeling familiar stings as debris peppered his back and shoulders. When the dust settled and the shouting died down, Marcus found himself surrounded by co-workers who looked at him with something approaching awe. Jimmy Castillo, the youngest member of their crew, was crying as he thanked Marcus over and over again. Pete Williams, a grandfather of 6 who had 30 years of construction experience, just kept shaking his head and muttering about guardian angels. "Thompson, that was the bravest damn thing I've ever seen," said Foreman Dave Bennett, a Vietnam veteran who rarely showed emotion. "You saved 3 lives today." But Marcus didn't feel like a hero. As he stood brushing concrete dust from his clothes, all he could think about was how natural it had felt to put himself between danger and innocent people. How his body had moved without conscious thought toward protection instead of destruction. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying, maybe. He wasn't as broken as he believed. The local news picked up the story, and by evening Marcus found himself reluctantly agreeing to a brief interview with Channel 3. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Park, asked him about his background and what had motivated him to risk his life for his co-workers. "I'm a veteran," Marcus said simply, uncomfortable with the camera's attention. "We're trained to run toward danger, not away from it." "Were you scared?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "No, when someone needs help, fear becomes secondary to action." The interview aired that night during the local news 3 minutes of coverage that painted Marcus as a humble hero who deflected praise while colleagues described his split-second decision to save lives. Emma Rodriguez watched from her living room couch, bouncing with excitement as she pointed at the television screen. "Mom, look, it's Mr. Marcus on TV. He's famous." Maria watched her giant friend downplay his heroism with characteristic modesty, and felt something shift in her chest. A recognition that this man who had saved her daughter and now saved his co-workers was someone special. Someone worth knowing better despite the shadows she sometimes glimpsed in his eyes. The next morning, Marcus arrived at work to find a stack of messages waiting for him at the site office. Parents thanking him for setting a good example, veterans organizations inviting him to speak at events, and surprisingly, several calls from social workers and community organizations asking if he would consider volunteering with at-risk youth. Message stood out from the rest. Dr. Patricia Hayes from the Sacramento Children's Center had left a detailed voicemail explaining how they worked with kids who had experienced trauma and abuse, children who often struggled to trust adults, especially large men who might remind them of their abusers. "Mr. Thompson, I know this might sound unusual, but we've found that sometimes the gentlest souls come in the most intimidating packages. Would you consider meeting with me to discuss how you might help some very special children?" Marcus stared at the phone number written in his own handwriting, remembering Emma's drawing of him as a protector, remembering the trust she had shown him in that alley, remembering how good it had felt to be someone worth believing in. After an hour of internal debate, he made the call. The Sacramento Children's Center occupied a converted Victorian mansion in the Midtown district, its cheerful yellow paint and wraparound porch designed to look welcoming rather than institutional. Dr. Hayes met Marcus at the front door, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering, but hadn't lost their compassion. "You're even bigger than you looked on television," she said, with a smile that took the sting out of what could have been an uncomfortable observation. "That's actually perfect for what I have in mind." She led him through hallways decorated with children's artwork and inspirational posters, explaining the center's mission of providing temporary housing and counseling services for kids removed from dangerous situations. Some stayed for days while family situations were resolved, others for months while permanent placements were arranged. "Our biggest challenge is with children who have been abused by male authority figures," Dr. Hayes explained as they walked. "They're terrified of men, especially large ones. Traditional therapy can take months just to get them comfortable enough to speak." Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he began to understand what she was suggesting. "You want me to work with abused children? I want you to be present with them. Not as a counselor or authority figure, but as a gentle giant who proves that size doesn't automatically equal danger. Sometimes healing begins with simply seeing that not all big men are threats." They stopped outside a playroom where Marcus could see several children through a window. A boy who couldn't have been more than 6 sat in a corner, rocking slightly, while clutching a stuffed dinosaur. Twin girls played with dolls at a small table, their movements careful and quiet, as if afraid of drawing attention. An older boy, maybe 10, sat reading a book with the intense focus of someone using literature to escape reality. "These kids have been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect them," Dr. Hayes continued. "They need to see that strength can be used for protection instead of harm." Marcus thought about his own hands, hands that had killed and destroyed, hands that had pulled triggers and thrown grenades, hands that had caused more death than he could quantify. The idea of using those same hands to comfort traumatized children seemed impossible, even sacrilegious. "I don't think I'm the right person for this," he said quietly. "You don't know what I've done." Dr. Hayes studied his profile with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades working with damaged people. "I know you're a combat veteran with multiple deployments. I know you've seen and done things that haunt you. And I know that yesterday, you risked your life to save 3 strangers without hesitation." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "The children in there have been hurt by people who were supposed to love them. They need to see that someone as physically powerful as their abusers can choose gentleness over violence, protection over harm. They need to see you." The volunteer orientation took place the following Saturday morning in a conference room filled with social workers, retired teachers, and community members who had answered the call to help vulnerable children. Marcus sat in a chair designed for normal-sized people, his knees nearly touching his chest, listening to presentations about trauma-informed care and appropriate boundaries with minors. During the lunch break, he found himself sitting alone at a picnic table in the center's backyard, questioning his decision to get involved. He was still wrestling with doubt when a small voice spoke from behind him. "Are you the giant from TV?" Marcus turned to find the 6-year-old boy from the playroom standing a careful distance away, still clutching his stuffed dinosaur. The child's eyes were too old for his face, holding wariness that should never exist in someone so young. "I guess." So Marcus said gently, "What's your name?" "Tyler." The boy took a half-step closer, curiosity beginning to overcome caution. "My social worker said you help people who are scared." The simplicity of the statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought about all the complex motivations that had brought him here, all the psychological baggage and guilt and desperate hope for redemption, and realized that to this child, it was beautifully simple. He was someone who helped scared people. "I try to," Marcus said honestly. Tyler edged closer, examining Marcus with the methodical attention children use when evaluating potential threats. "You're really big." "I am." "Are you mean?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with a lifetime of terrible experience compressed into 4 simple words. Marcus understood that his answer would determine not just whether this child would trust him, but whether he would trust himself. "No," Marcus said quietly. "I'm not mean. Sometimes I'm sad, and sometimes I'm angry at bad things that happened before I came here, but I'm not mean." Tyler considered this response with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. Slowly, he moved closer to the picnic table, close enough that Marcus could see fading bruises on his arms, close enough to notice how the boy flinched slightly when a car door slammed in the parking lot. "Can you sit on the ground?" Tyler asked. "You're too tall when you sit on the chair." Marcus slid off the bench and settled cross-legged on the grass, bringing himself closer to Tyler's eye level. The child approached until he was just out of arm's reach, a safe distance that allowed for conversation while preserving escape routes. "That's better," Tyler said. "Now you don't look so scary." They sat together for 10 minutes, mostly uncomfortable. Silence broken by Tyler's occasional questions about Marcus's height, his job, and whether he liked dinosaurs. When Dr. Hayes came looking for Marcus to continue the orientation, she found them comparing hand sizes Tyler's small palm pressed against Marcus's massive one while they discussed how many Tyler hands it took to equal one Marcus hand. "I see you've met Tyler," Dr. Hayes said with approval. "He doesn't usually talk to new people this quickly." Tyler looked up at the doctor with something approaching excitement. He's not scary when he sits down, and he knows about dinosaurs. After Tyler returned to his playgroup, Dr. Hayes walked Marcus back toward the building. That was remarkable. It usually takes weeks for Tyler to warm up to male staff members. He did all the work, Marcus said. I just sat still and answered his questions. Exactly. You let him control the interaction, set the boundaries, determine the pace. That's advanced trauma-informed care, and you did it instinctively. Marcus began volunteering at the center 3 afternoons a week, spending his time in the common areas where children could approach him, if they chose, while never pressuring anyone for interaction. Some kids ignored him completely. Others watched him from across rooms like wildlife observers studying a potentially dangerous animal. But gradually, a few began to venture closer. The twin girls, Ashley and Amanda, started by playing elaborate games that happened to take place near wherever Marcus was sitting. Their play involved complex narratives about brave princesses and friendly dragons, stories that always seemed to feature powerful protectors who used their strength to keep small creatures safe from harm. 10-year-old Michael, the boy who read constantly, eventually began bringing his books to the same areas where Marcus volunteered. He never spoke directly to Marcus for the first month, but gradually started reading aloud in a voice just loud enough for the giant to hear, sharing stories about heroes and adventures with someone who listened without judgment or interruption. Breakthrough with Tyler came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when the boy was having what Dr. Hayes later described as a trauma episode, a sudden regression triggered by the arrival of his biological father for a supervised visit. Tyler had locked himself in a bathroom stall and was screaming with terror that made Marcus's chest ache with recognition of pure animal fear. While staff members tried unsuccessfully to coax Tyler out, Marcus sat down outside the bathroom door and began talking in the same quiet voice he had used that first day in the backyard. He didn't try to convince Tyler to come out or promise that everything would be okay. Instead, he simply shared his own experience of being afraid. I get scared sometimes too, Tyler, really scared, like there's something dangerous coming in. I can't get away from it. When that happens, I try to remember that being scared is okay, that it means my brain is trying to protect me. The screaming gradually subsided, replaced by hitching sobs that sounded like a small heartbreaking. Marcus continued talking, sharing stories about friendly dinosaurs and brave construction workers and little girls who drew pictures that made giants feel better about themselves. After 20 minutes, the bathroom stall door opened slowly, and Tyler emerged with tear-stained cheeks and eyes red from crying. Without hesitation, he walked directly to Marcus and climbed into his lap, curling against the giant's chest like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Marcus held him carefully, one massive hand gently stroking Tyler's hair while the child cried out months of accumulated fear and pain. The trust implicit in the moment overwhelmed Marcus. This broken little boy, who had every reason to fear large men, had chosen to seek comfort in his arms. "You're safe," Marcus whispered, the words carrying weight of absolute promise. "Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm here." As Tyler's tears gradually subsided and his breathing returned to normal, Marcus realized something profound had shifted inside himself. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. His size, his strength, his protective instincts, all the qualities that had made him an effective soldier, could serve a different purpose now. That evening, Marcus called Maria Rodriguez from his apartment, needing to share the day's revelation with someone who might understand. "I think I found my mission," he told her, his voice thick with emotion he was still learning to express. "Tell me," Maria said softly, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice, the warmth of someone who cared about his journey toward healing. As he described Tyler's trust and the profound satisfaction of using his strength to comfort rather than destroy, Marcus felt the final pieces of his fractured identity beginning to reassemble into something new, something better than what he had been before. 6 months into his volunteer work at the Sacramento Children's Center, Marcus received a call that would test everything he had learned about using his strength. Protection instead of destruction. Dr. Hayes's voice was tight with controlled urgency when she reached him at home on a Sunday evening. Marcus, we have a situation. I need to ask if you're available for an emergency placement tonight. A new arrival had come to the center under circumstances that made even experienced social workers uneasy. 11-year-old Sophia Brennan had been removed from a trafficking ring that operated out of seemingly respectable businesses throughout Northern California. She hadn't spoken a word since her rescue 3 days earlier, and she became violent whenever male staff members came within 10 feet of her. She's been through hell, Marcus. Worse than anything we typically see here. The FBI agents who interviewed her said she fought like a cornered animal until they brought in a female agent. Even then, she only communicated through drawings. Marcus listened to the details with growing horror and familiar rage. These were the same protective instincts that had made him an effective soldier, but now they were focused on a different kind of enemy predators who targeted the most vulnerable members of society. What do you need from me? Just be present. Don't approach her. Don't try to talk to her. Just let her see that not all large men are threats. The other children trust you now, and kids pick up on that energy. If Tyler and Ashley and Michael feel safe around you, maybe Sophia will eventually understand that you're different. Marcus arrived at the center to find the building in controlled chaos. Police officers completed paperwork while social workers coordinated temporary placements for children whose sleep had been disrupted by Sophia's arrival. Through a window, Marcus could see the girl sitting in the corner of the main playroom, her back pressed against 2 walls that formed a defensive position, giving her clear sightlines to all entrances. Sophia was small for 11. With dark hair that had been roughly cut and eyes that held the hyper-vigilant awareness of someone who had learned that survival depended on constant assessment of threats. She wore clothes donated by the center jeans and a purple sweater that were clean but clearly unfamiliar to her. In her hands, she clutched a sketchpad that Dr. Hayes had given her, the only communication tool she had accepted. She drew this an hour ago. Dr. Hayes showed Marcus a sketch that made his stomach clench. It depicted a large man standing over a small figure, but unlike Emma's drawing that had shown protection and safety, this image conveyed pure menace. The man's hands were raised, his posture aggressive, his face a mask of cruel intention. Marcus studied the drawing, understanding immediately how Sophia saw the world. To her, his size automatically categorized him as a threat, his presence as a prelude to violence. Every positive interaction he'd had with other children meant nothing in the face of Sophia's lived experience of betrayal by people who should have protected her. "I'll stay as long as you need me to," Marcus said simply. He settled into a chair on the opposite side of the playroom from Sophia, positioning himself where she could see him clearly while maintaining maximum distance. Marcus brought a book, one of the construction management texts he was studying for a promotion, and began reading quietly, making no attempt to interact with the frightened girl. For 3 hours, Sophia watched him with the intensity of a prey animal evaluating a predator. Every time Marcus turned a page, every time he shifted position, every time he cleared his throat, Sophia's entire body tensed as if preparing to run or fight. But gradually, as the evening wore on and Marcus did nothing more threatening than read about concrete mixing ratios and building codes, her vigilance began to show microscopic cracks. Tyler appeared in the doorway around 9 o'clock, approaching Marcus with the casual familiarity they had developed over months of interaction. The boy had been placed with a foster family, but still visited the center regularly for counseling sessions. "Hi, Mr. Marcus," Tyler said, climbing onto the chair beside the giant without hesitation. "Can you help me with my homework?" Marcus glanced toward Sophia, noting how intently she watched this interaction between a small child and a large man. Tyler's complete lack of fear seemed to confuse her, as if his behavior contradicted everything she had been taught about such. Relationships, what subject? Marcus asked, keeping his voice low and gentle as Tyler always preferred. Math. Mrs. Patterson says I need to learn multiplication tables, but they're really hard. For the next hour, Marcus helped Tyler with homework while Sophia observed from her corner. The math lesson was punctuated by Tyler's stories about his foster family, his new school, and the dinosaur book he was writing that featured a friendly giant who protected smaller creatures from dangers. The boys' chatter filled the room with normalcy, creating an atmosphere where even Sophia's hypervigilance seemed to relax slightly. When Tyler's foster mother arrived to pick him up, the boy hugged Marcus goodbye with the unconscious affection of someone who had never questioned whether he was safe in the giant's presence. As they walked toward the door, Tyler stopped and looked back at Sophia. Mr. Marcus is nice, he announced to the room in general. He doesn't hurt people. He helps them. After Tyler left, the playroom fell silent except for the distant sounds of other children getting ready for bed. Sophia had moved closer during the homework session, not approaching Marcus directly, but shifting from her corner to a position behind a couch that still provided protection while offering a better view of his activities. Marcus returned to his book, but found himself thinking about the drawings Tyler had shown him pictures of their first meeting. Images of Marcus reading stories and helping with crafts. Sketches that consistently portrayed him as a protector rather than a threat. Tyler's artistic evolution had documented his own healing journey, showing how trust could develop between someone small and vulnerable and someone large and initially frightening. Around 11 o'clock, Marcus noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Sophia had left her defensive position and was approaching the bookshelf near his chair, moving with the careful stealth of someone accustomed to avoiding detection. She selected a children's book and settled on the floor about 8 feet away from Marcus, close enough to share the light from his reading lamp, but far enough to maintain her escape routes. The book Sophia had chosen was Where the Wild Things Are, and as she turned its pages, Marcus caught glimpses of Maurice Sendak's illustrations of monsters who seemed fierce but ultimately proved to be gentle. He wondered if the choice was coincidental or if Sophia was working through her own understanding of creatures who appeared dangerous but might actually be safe. They read in silence for another hour, sharing space without interaction, too solitary. Figures connected only by lamplight and the gradual recognition that peaceful coexistence was possible. When Dr. Hayes came to check on them around midnight, she found Marcus still absorbed in his construction manual while Sophia had fallen asleep on the floor, the monster book open across her chest. She's never fallen asleep with a man in the room, Dr. Hayes whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Not once since we've had her. Marcus looked down at the sleeping child, noting how young she appeared when fear wasn't etched across her features. In sleep, Sophia looked like any 11-year-old girl, vulnerable and innocent despite everything she had endured. Should I leave? Marcus asked quietly. No, let's see what happens when she wakes up. Dr. Hayes arranged blankets around Sophia without waking her, then settled into another chair to maintain the overnight vigil that traumatized children sometimes required. Marcus returned to his reading, but found his attention constantly drawn to the small figure sleeping nearby. Amazed that someone with such good reason to fear men had chosen to rest in his presence, Sophia woke at dawn, disoriented and momentarily panicked before remembering where she was. Her eyes found Marcus immediately, scanning his posture and expression for signs of threat. Finding none, she sat up slowly, clutching her book like a shield while evaluating this unprecedented situation. She had slept in the same room as a large man and awakened unharmed. Good morning, Sophia, Dr. Hayes said gently. You were very brave last night. Sophia's response was to reach for her sketchpad and begin drawing with intense concentration. After 15 minutes, She tore out the page and placed it on the floor, between herself and Marcus before retreating to her original corner. The new drawing showed the same large man from her previous sketch, but this time he was sitting in a chair reading a book. The menacing posture was gone, replaced by a relaxed position that suggested absorption in peaceful activity rather than violent intention. Most significantly, the small figure in the drawing was no longer cowering beneath the man's threatening presence. Instead, she was sitting nearby with her own book, sharing space without fear. Marcus studied the image, understanding its significance. Sophia had documented her own evolution of perception, showing how her understanding of him had changed through observation rather than interaction. The drawing was both progress report and tentative peace offering, a way of communicating that she had begun to recategorize him from definitely dangerous to possibly safe. "Thank you, Sophia," Marcus said quietly, careful not to move from his chair or make any gesture that might seem threatening. "That's a beautiful drawing." Sophia's response was to create another sketch, this one showing Marcus helping Tyler with homework while she watched from behind the couch. Every detail was accurate: Tyler's relaxed posture, Marcus's gentle expression, her own careful positioning that balanced curiosity with caution. The artistic documentation of their evening together suggested that Sophia had been studying the interaction with the analytical intensity of someone learning a new language. Dr. Hayes examined the drawings with professional interest and personal amazement. In her 25 years of working with traumatized children, she had rarely seen such rapid progress in trust building, particularly with victims of Sophia's specific type of abuse. "She's communicating through art because verbal communication was used as a weapon against her," Dr. Hayes explained to Marcus during a brief consultation in the hallway. "The men who hurt her used words to manipulate, threaten, and control. Drawing feels safer because it allows her to maintain distance while still expressing complex thoughts." Over the following weeks, Marcus maintained his evening presence at the center, creating a routine that Sophia could observe and evaluate at her own pace. She began leaving drawings for him, images that showed her growing understanding of his character and role in the children's lives. The pictures evolved from cautious documentation to something approaching artistic gifts, detailed sketches that captured moments of gentleness and protection she had witnessed. One drawing showed Marcus comforting Ashley during a nightmare, his massive hand gently stroking the little girl's hair while she clung to him for security. Another depicted him reading stories to a group of children, all of them clustered around his chair with expressions of rapt attention and complete trust. Each image served as both communication and therapy, allowing Sophia to process her observations while gradually restructuring her understanding of what large men could represent. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening when Michael, the bookish 10-year-old, had an asthma attack during story time. As Marcus helped the boy use his inhaler and called for medical assistance, Sophia moved closer than she had ever ventured before. She didn't approach Marcus directly, but positioned herself where she could clearly observe his careful handling of Michael's crisis. After the paramedics had checked Michael and determined he was stable, Sophia approached the spot where Marcus was sitting and placed a new drawing on the floor beside his chair. This sketch showed Marcus kneeling beside a small figure, his hands positioned to help rather than harm, his expression one of concern and protectiveness. But what made this drawing different from all the others was the addition of a second small figure standing nearby, clearly Sophia herself, no longer hiding behind furniture or watching from corners, but present and engaged, a witness to compassion rather than a victim of violence. "Thank you for helping Michael," Sophia said quietly, her first spoken words since arriving at the center. Marcus looked down at this brave girl, who had found her voice through observing his actions rather than hearing his words, and felt something profound settle into place in his chest. This was why he had survived Afghanistan, why he had carried the weight of his past, why he had been led to this moment where his capacity for protection could serve those who needed it most. "You're welcome, Sophia," he replied gently. That's what we do here. We take care of each other. Sophia nodded solemnly, as if accepting the fundamental truth about how the world could work when the right people were in charge of keeping others safe. She returned to her corner, but for the first time since her arrival, she faced toward the room rather than away from it, ready to observe and perhaps eventually participate in this strange new environment, where strength served safety instead of threatening it. That night, as Marcus drove home through the Sacramento streets, he thought about the journey that had brought him from the mountains of Afghanistan to a children's center in California, from someone who dealt death to someone who protected life. The transition hadn't erased his past or magically healed all his wounds, but it had given his experiences meaning beyond the destruction they had once represented. Sophia's trust, earned through patience rather than words, felt more valuable than any military commendation he had ever received. In helping her recalibrate her understanding of what men could be, Marcus had completed his own transformation from weapon to guardian, from someone who took lives to someone who gave hope back to the living. The phone call that would change everything came on a Friday afternoon in March, 8 months after Sophia had spoken her first words at the center. Detective Rachel Morrison from the Sacramento Police Department's Special Victims Unit had a request that made Marcus's blood run cold and his protective instincts surge to maximum alert. "We need your help with something unprecedented, Mr. Thompson. There's a trafficking network we've been tracking for 2 years, and we finally have enough evidence to move. But there's a complication. We've identified 17 children being held in various locations, and based on what we know about their conditioning, they're going to be terrified of male officers during the rescue operation." Marcus listened as Detective Morrison explained the scope of the operation. The criminal organization had been operating sophisticated facilities disguised as legitimate businesses throughout Northern California, using psychological manipulation and physical intimidation to control their victims. The children ranged in age from 7 to 15, and preliminary intelligence suggested they had been programmed to view all adult men as threats. "Dr. Hayes recommended you specifically. She says you have a unique ability to de-escalate situations involving traumatized children, particularly those who've been conditioned to fear men. We need someone who can be present during the raids to help these kids understand they're being rescued, not transferred to new captors." The operation was scheduled for the following Tuesday at dawn, coordinated across 12 locations simultaneously to prevent the network from destroying evidence or moving victims. Marcus would be assigned to the team hitting the primary facility, a warehouse complex in West Sacramento, where intelligence indicated the highest number of children were being held. Marcus spent the weekend in intensive preparation with the FBI's victim specialists and child psychologists who would be part of the rescue teams. They briefed him on trauma responses, taught him specific de-escalation techniques for children who had been severely conditioned, and prepared him for scenarios that tested the limits of his emotional control. "These children have been systematically broken," explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a federal specialist in trafficking victim recovery. "They've been taught that resistance leads to punishment, that trust leads to betrayal, that the only way to survive is complete submission to adult authority. When we breach those doors, they're going to expect the worst possible outcomes." Marcus studied photographs and case files until the faces blurred together. Children who had been stolen from families, runaways who had been exploited by predators, victims who had been passed between criminal organizations like commodities. Each file represented a life interrupted, innocence destroyed, futures stolen by people who viewed children as objects to be used and discarded. The night before the operation, Marcus couldn't sleep. He found himself at the Rodriguez house, sitting in Maria's kitchen while Emma did homework at the table and the evening news played softly in the background. The normalcy of the scene, a mother helping her daughter with math problems, the familiar sounds of domestic life provided anchor points against the darkness he would face tomorrow. "You're scared," Emma observed with the directness children use when adults try to hide their emotions. She had grown taller over the past year, her gap-toothed smile now complete with permanent teeth, but her ability to read Marcus's moods had only sharpened with time, a little, Marcus admitted. "Tomorrow I'm going to help some children who have been hurt very badly. I want to make sure I do everything right." Emma set down her pencil and studied Marcus with serious eyes. "Do you remember what you told me when I was scared of the monster under my bed?" Marcus smiled despite his anxiety. "That monsters are only scary until someone bigger and stronger decides to protect you instead of letting them win." "Exactly. And you're the biggest and strongest person I know, and you always choose to protect people. So those kids are going to be okay because you'll be there." The simplicity of Emma's logic cut through Marcus's complicated fears and self-doubt. She was right. He had spent the past year learning how to use his size and strength for protection instead of destruction. Tomorrow would be the ultimate test of that transformation. The raid began at 5:47 a.m., with perfectly coordinated breaches across all 12 locations. Marcus followed the FBI tactical team through the warehouse entrance, his massive frame made even more imposing by the body armor and tactical gear he wore to blend in with the law enforcement officers surrounding him. The facility was larger than the briefings had suggested, with multiple rooms connected by narrow corridors that felt like a maze designed to confuse and intimidate. The first children they found were in what appeared to be a makeshift dormitory, 12 mattresses on the floor, personal belongings kept in plastic bags, windows covered with boards that blocked out natural light. The children huddled together. When the officers entered, their faces displaying the blank compliance of people who had learned that resistance only made things worse. They ranged in age from elementary school to high school, but they all shared the same haunted expression of premature aging that comes from surviving horrors no child should experience. "Kids were police officers," announced Agent Sarah Chun, the team leader. "You're safe now. We're here to help you." The response was silence and increased trembling. Several children pressed themselves against the back wall as if trying to disappear entirely. A boy who couldn't have been more than 10 began rocking back and forth, his eyes fixed on the floor in a pattern Marcus recognized from his early days with Tyler. Marcus slowly removed his tactical helmet and body armor, making himself appear less threatening despite the impossibility of diminishing his actual size. He sat down on the floor near the doorway, positioning himself where the children could see him clearly while maintaining their escape routes. "My name is Marcus," he said in the gentle voice he had learned to use at the center. "I know you're scared, and that's okay. Being scared means your brain is trying to protect you, which is smart." A girl who appeared to be about 14 raised her eyes slightly, studying Marcus with the cautious assessment of someone evaluating potential threats. She had been designated as a leader among the children, according to the intelligence briefings, someone the traffickers had used to maintain order and compliance. "We're not here to hurt anyone," Marcus continued, speaking directly to the girl while including all the children in his calm, steady tone. "We're here because people who care about you have been looking for you. People who want to make sure you're safe." The girl intelligence files identified her as Melissa Torres, missing from Fresno for 14 months, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Are you going to take us somewhere else?" The question carried layers of meaning that broke Marcus's heart. These children had been moved from location to location, promised safety only to find new forms of captivity. Trust had been used as a weapon against them so many times that the concept had lost all meaning. "We're going to take you to places where people will help you heal," Marcus said honestly. "Places with doctors and counselors and social workers, whose only job is making sure you're okay. No one is going to hurt you anymore." A younger boy near the back of the group raised his hand slightly, the gesture automatic despite their circumstances. Marcus nodded to him encouragingly. "Are you a policeman?" the boy asked. No, I'm a volunteer. I work with children who have been hurt, helping them feel safe again. I came here because I wanted to make sure you knew that not all big people are dangerous. Marcus slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, the drawing Sophia had made showing him helping Michael during his asthma attack. He placed it on the floor where the children could see it. A little girl named Sophia drew this picture of me. She was very scared when we first met because bad people had hurt her. But she learned that some big people use their strength to protect instead of harm. Melissa crept closer to examine the drawing, her movement so cautious it was barely perceptible. The other children watched her reaction, taking cues from someone they had learned to trust for survival guidance. She drew you helping someone. Melissa observed. Yes, that's what I do now. I help children who have been scared feel safe again. The conversation continued for 20 minutes while FBI agents processed the scene and medical personnel prepared to examine the children. Marcus answered questions about where they would be taken, who would care for them, what would happen to the people who had hurt them. His responses were honest but gentle, acknowledging their fears while providing realistic hope for their futures. The breakthrough came when the youngest child in the group, a girl who couldn't have been more than 7, approached Marcus with the directness that sometimes survives even severe trauma. She had been clutching a small stuffed rabbit throughout the rescue, and she held it up for Marcus to see. Mr. Whiskers is scared too, she said solemnly. Marcus nodded with appropriate seriousness. Mr. Whiskers has been very brave, taking care of you in a scary place. Would you like me to tell him that he's safe now? The girl considered this offer carefully, then handed Marcus the stuffed animal. He accepted it with the reverence due to a sacred trust, holding the worn rabbit gently while speaking to it in the same calm voice he had used with the children. Mr. Whiskers, you did a good job protecting your friend. The scary times are over now. From now on, your only job is being loved. The simple interaction broke the dam of control the children had been maintaining. Several began crying, not the desperate sobs of fresh trauma, but the relieved tears of people who had been holding their breath for months and could finally exhale. Others moved closer to Marcus, drawn by the same instinct that had led Sophia to trust him. The recognition that some people's strength served protection rather than domination. As the children were carefully escorted to waiting ambulances and victim advocates, Marcus found himself walking beside Melissa, who had emerged as their unofficial spokesperson. She looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom no teenager should possess. Will we see you again? She asked. If you want to, Marcus replied. Some of the children I work with were rescued like you were. They might want to meet you, to show you that healing is possible. I'd like that, Melissa said quietly. I want to believe that things can get better. The operation resulted in the rescue of 31 children from 12 locations, the arrest of 47 suspects, and the dismantling of a trafficking network that had operated with impunity for over 3 years. But for Marcus, the success was measured in smaller victories, the moment when frightened children chose to trust him, the tears of relief that replaced tears of terror, the possibility that his presence had made their rescue less traumatic. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself working more closely with law enforcement agencies throughout Northern California. His reputation as someone who could help traumatized children feel safe during rescue operations spread through networks of social workers, FBI agents, and victim advocates. He was called to assist with domestic violence cases where children had witnessed abuse, kidnapping recoveries where victims needed immediate trauma support, and situations where his unique combination of intimidating presence and gentle demeanor could de-escalate dangerous encounters. The work was emotionally exhausting and often heartbreaking, but it provided Marcus with something he had never found in civilian life, a sense of mission that matched the intensity and importance of his military service. He was still a warrior, But now he fought against predators who targeted the innocent rather than foreign enemies on distant battlefields. Dr. Hayes observed the evolution of Marcus's role with professional fascination and personal admiration. The broken veteran who had first walked into her center seeking purpose had transformed into something unprecedented, a specialized first responder whose expertise lay in helping children transition from captivity to safety. "You've created an entirely new field," she told him during one of their regular consultation meetings. "Tactical child advocacy. Using your military training and natural protective instincts to serve the most vulnerable members of our society." Marcus had never thought of his work in such formal terms, but he recognized the truth in Dr. Hayes' assessment. His size, his training, his understanding of fear and violence, all the qualities that had made him an effective soldier had found new purpose in civilian applications that served protection rather than destruction. The transformation was complete when Marcus received a letter from Tyler, now thriving in his foster placement and preparing to start middle school. The boy had enclosed a new drawing, a comic book style illustration showing Marcus in tactical gear, standing protectively in front of a group of children, with the caption, "The Guardian Giant, Protector of the Innocent." Looking at Tyler's artwork, Marcus understood that his journey from soldier to protector was more than personal redemption. It was proof that people could change, that experiences meant to destroy could be transformed into sources of strength, that the capacity for violence could be redirected toward the defense of those who needed protection most. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were different now. Instead of being haunted by the faces of those he had killed, Marcus dreamed of children he had helped save, of frightened voices that had learned to trust again, of drawings that showed him not as a weapon of war, but as a guardian of peace. He had finally found his answer to Emma's long-ago question about being a superhero. He was real, he was flawed, he carried scars from battles fought in distant lands, but he had chosen to use his strength for protection rather than destruction. And that choice had transformed him into something the world desperately needed. A warrior who fought for innocence instead of against enemies. Someone whose greatest victory was not in taking lives, but in giving hope back to the living. 2 years after the trafficking raid that had established Marcus as a specialized first responder, he received an invitation that would bring his journey full circle in ways he never could have anticipated. The letter arrived on official Department of Veterans Affairs letterhead, signed by Dr. Amanda Foster, director of the National PTSD Treatment Center in Palo Alto. "Mr. Thompson, your work with traumatized children has gained national attention. Within therapeutic communities, we would like to invite you to speak at our annual conference on innovative approaches to veteran rehabilitation. Your transition from combat veteran to child advocate represents a unique model of post-service purpose that could benefit thousands of struggling veterans." Marcus stared at the invitation for a long time, remembering the broken man who had returned from Afghanistan, convinced he had nothing valuable to offer the world. The idea of sharing his story with other veterans felt both terrifying and necessary, an opportunity to show that the darkness of military experience didn't have to define the rest of a soldier's life. He accepted the invitation, but insisted on bringing reinforcements. Emma Rodriguez, now 13 and preparing for high school, would accompany him to the conference. Her perspective as someone who had witnessed his transformation from the beginning would provide context that Marcus knew he couldn't articulate alone. The week before the conference, Marcus found himself in an unexpected situation that would test everything he had learned about healing and redemption. Detective Morrison called with an urgent request that made his stomach clench with familiar dread. "Marcus, we have a hostage situation at Lincoln Elementary. A veteran having a psychotic break has barricaded himself in a classroom with 26 first graders. He's armed, he's not responding to negotiators, and the tactical team is concerned that a forced entry could result in casualties." The hostage taker was identified as Staff Sergeant Kevin Walsh, a 3-tour Iraq veteran who had been struggling with PTSD and substance abuse since his discharge 18 months earlier. His ex-wife taught at Lincoln Elementary, and witnesses reported that Walsh had arrived during morning recess demanding to see her, claiming that enemies were pursuing him and that he needed to protect the children from imminent danger. "He's not trying to hurt the kids," Detective Morrison explained. As Marcus raced toward the school, his delusions have convinced him that he's protecting them from some kind of attack. But he's heavily armed and increasingly agitated. "We need someone who understands what he's going through, someone who can speak his language." Marcus arrived at Lincoln Elementary to find the school surrounded by police vehicles, SWAT teams, and news crews broadcasting live coverage of the unfolding crisis. Parents stood behind barricades, some crying, others shouting demands for action, all of them desperate for information about their children's safety. Inside the classroom, Walsh had arranged desks into a defensive perimeter and positioned himself where he could monitor all entrances while keeping the children in what he believed was a safe zone. The first graders sat in a circle on the reading carpet, most of them crying quietly while their teacher, Mrs. Jennifer Coleman, tried to keep them calm despite her own terror. "Why won't anyone listen to me?" Walsh shouted through the barricaded door when negotiators tried to establish communication. "They're coming for these kids. I'm the only one who can protect them." The delusion was heartbreakingly familiar to Marcus: the hypervigilance, the misplaced protective instincts, the inability to distinguish between past threats and present reality. Walsh's mind had transported him back to Iraq, where protecting innocent civilians from insurgent attacks had been his primary mission. Now, in his fractured mental state, he saw enemies everywhere and believed the children were in imminent danger. Marcus studied the school's layout with the tactical team, identifying potential entry points and escape routes while the crisis negotiators continued their attempts to establish dialogue with Walsh. The situation was deteriorating. Rapidly, Walsh's responses were becoming increasingly incoherent, and his agitation suggested that his grip on reality was slipping further with each passing hour. "Let me try talking to him," Marcus told Incident Commander Captain Lisa Torres, veteran to veteran. "Maybe I can help him understand that the children are safe." The decision to allow Marcus direct contact with an armed and unstable hostage-taker violated several standard protocols, but Captain Torres had worked with Marcus on previous cases and understood his unique ability to connect with traumatized individuals. Marcus approached the classroom door alone, his hands visible and empty, his voice calm and steady as he identified himself to Walsh. "Staff Sergeant Walsh, my name is Marcus Thompson. I'm a veteran 2-6 deployments to Afghanistan. I heard you're protecting some children in there, and I wanted to thank you for keeping them safe." The response came after a long pause. "Who sent you? How do I know you're not one of them?" Marcus recognized the paranoid thinking that often accompanied severe PTSD episodes. Walsh's military training had taught him to trust no one during combat situations, and his current delusion had activated those same survival instincts in a civilian environment where they didn't apply. "Nobody sent me, brother. I volunteer with kids who've been through trauma, and when I heard there was another veteran trying to protect children, I wanted to make sure you had backup." Marcus slowly settled onto the floor outside the classroom door, making himself comfortable for what he knew would be a long conversation. His approach was the same one he used with frightened children: patience, consistency, and the gradual building of trust through honest communication. "Tell me about the threat you're seeing," Marcus said. "What kind of danger are these kids facing?" Walsh's response revealed the extent of his psychological break. He described enemies moving through the school, sophisticated attacks being planned, intelligence reports that only he had access to. The details were elaborate and internally consistent, products of a mind that had spent years in actual combat zones and was now applying that experience to imagined threats. Marcus listened without contradiction, understanding that challenging Walsh's delusions directly would only increase his agitation. Instead, he validated the veteran's protective instincts while gradually introducing alternative perspectives. "You're doing everything right, keeping those kids in a secure position," Marcus said. "That shows good tactical thinking. But I'm wondering if maybe the intelligence about the threats might be outdated. Sometimes command doesn't update us when situations change." The conversation continued for 3 hours, with Marcus slowly building rapport while tactical teams prepared for multiple contingencies. He shared his own struggles with transitioning from military to civilian life, describing the hypervigilance and confusion that had plagued him after returning from Afghanistan. "I know what it's like to see enemies everywhere," Marcus said honestly. "To feel like the only person who understands how dangerous the world really is. But sometimes our training makes us see threats that aren't actually there anymore." The breakthrough came when Marcus asked Walsh about his own children. The veteran had 2 daughters, ages 6 and 8, who lived with his ex-wife in another state. As Walsh talked about his girls, his voice softened and his delusions began to crack slightly. "I just want to protect them," Walsh said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everyone thinks I'm crazy, but I know what's out there. I've seen what people do to kids." Marcus understood that Walsh's protective instincts had become twisted by mental illness and substance abuse, transforming legitimate concerns into dangerous delusions. The veteran genuinely believed he was saving the children in the classroom from harm, just as he had once protected civilians in Iraq. "Your daughters are lucky to have a father who cares so much about their safety," Marcus said gently. "But right now, the best way to protect all children, including the ones in that classroom, is to make sure this situation ends peacefully. Can you help me do that?" The negotiation reached its critical moment when Walsh finally agreed to release the children in exchange for a guarantee that Marcus would remain with him to discuss the ongoing security threats. It was an arrangement that violated every hostage situation protocol, but Captain Torres recognized that Walsh's trust in Marcus represented their best opportunity for a peaceful resolution. The classroom door opened slowly, and 26 first graders filed out under Mrs. Coleman's guidance, most of them crying but none physically harmed. Walsh stood in the doorway, his weapon lowered but still in his hands, his eyes scanning the hallway for the enemies his mind insisted were lurking nearby. Marcus entered the classroom alone, noting the elaborate defensive preparations Walsh had constructed, desks positioned to provide cover, windows blocked to prevent sniper attacks, supplies organized for a prolonged siege. The arrangements demonstrated both military competence and complete disconnection from reality. "You did good work here," Marcus told Walsh, acknowledging the veteran's tactical skills while slowly moving closer. "This is a solid defensive position. But I think the immediate threat has passed. Maybe it's time to stand down." Walsh's response was to finally lower his weapon completely, his body sagging with exhaustion as the adrenaline of perceived combat began to fade. "I couldn't let anything happen to them. They reminded me of my girls." "I know," Marcus said, understanding that Walsh's actions had been motivated by love rather than malice. "You're a good father and a good soldier. But sometimes protecting people means knowing when to trust others to help." The arrest was gentle, conducted by officers who understood they were dealing with a sick veteran rather than a criminal. Walsh was taken to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. His weapons were secured, and the children were reunited with their families without any physical injuries. But the impact of the incident extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Marcus found himself thinking about the thin line between his own recovery and Walsh's breakdown, recognizing that different circumstances or treatment could have led him down a similar path of confusion and misplaced protection. At the Veterans Conference in Palo Alto 3 days later, Marcus stood before an audience of 400 mental health professionals, fellow veterans and family members affected by PTSD. Emma sat in the front row, now tall enough that her feet touched the floor when she sat in adult-sized chairs, her presence providing the courage he needed to share his story honestly. "I killed people in Afghanistan," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the weight of the admission. "Good people, bad people, people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when I was trying to keep my squad alive. For years after I came home, I believed that violence was the only thing I was good at, that my capacity for destruction defined who I was as a person." He told them about the alley where he first met Emma, about the children's center where he learned that strength could serve protection, about Sophia's drawings that had shown him how healing could happen through patience rather than force. He described the trafficking raid where his military skills had served rescue instead of combat, and the recent hostage situation where understanding another veteran's pain had prevented tragedy. "The turning point wasn't when I stopped being a soldier," Marcus continued. "It was when I learned that being a soldier could mean different things. In Afghanistan, I protected my squad by eliminating threats. In Sacramento, I protect children by being someone they can trust. The skills are the same. The mission is what changed." Emma joined him at the podium for the final portion of his presentation, her teenage confidence a stark contrast to the frightened 8-year-old he had first encountered. She spoke about watching Marcus transform from someone who seemed scary to someone who made her feel safer than anyone else in the world. "Mr. Marcus taught me that people aren't defined by the worst things they've done," Emma said, her voice clear and strong. "They're defined by what they choose to do next." He chose to protect instead of destroy, to heal instead of hurt. "That's why he's my hero." The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but what moved Marcus most were the individual conversations. Afterward, veterans approached him with tears in their eyes, describing their own struggles with finding purpose after military service. Mental health professionals asked detailed questions about his methods for working with traumatized children. Family members shared stories of loved ones who were struggling with PTSD and asked for advice about supporting their recovery. Dr. Foster pulled Marcus aside after the formal presentation, her expression mixing professional excitement with personal admiration. "You've developed something revolutionary, a therapeutic model that transforms the source of trauma into a tool for healing others. Have you considered establishing a formal program?" The idea had been growing in Marcus's mind for months, but hearing it articulated by a national expert in veteran mental health gave it new weight and possibility. A training program for veterans who wanted to work with traumatized children, combining military experience with specialized education in child psychology and trauma recovery. "Warriors to Guardians," Marcus said, the name emerging fully formed as if it had been waiting for this moment. Teaching veterans to use their protective instincts and tactical skills to help the most vulnerable members of society. 6 months later, the first class of Warriors to Guardians trainees began their certification program at the Sacramento Children's Center. 12 veterans from various branches of the military, all struggling with PTSD and searching for post-service purpose, learned to apply their combat experience to civilian protection missions. Marcus found himself in the unexpected role of instructor and mentor, teaching former soldiers how to de-escalate crisis situations involving children, how to build trust with trauma survivors, how to transform their capacity for violence into a specialized form of protection that served healing rather than harm. Program success exceeded every expectation. Within 2 years, Warriors to Guardians graduates were working with law enforcement agencies throughout California, serving as specialized first responders for situations involving child victims. They assisted with domestic violence cases, participated in trafficking raids, provided security for children testifying in court cases, and helped establish safety protocols for facilities serving vulnerable youth. Each graduate carried forward Marcus's central lesson that the experiences meant to break them could become the foundation for serving others. that their deepest wounds could become sources of strength when directed toward protection instead of destruction. Standing in the Children's Center's training facility, watching a former Marine learn to comfort a traumatized child with the same intensity he had once brought to combat operations, Marcus understood that his journey from soldier to guardian had become something larger than personal redemption. It had become a pathway for other broken warriors to find their way home, not to the people they had been before war changed them, but to the people they could become when their strength served love instead of violence. 5 years after founding Warriors to Guardians, Marcus Thompson stood before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, his massive frame filling the witness chair as senators and staff members listened to testimony that would reshape how America thought about veteran reintegration in child protection services. The hearing had been prompted by a comprehensive study conducted by Johns Hopkins University, documenting the extraordinary success rates of programs that paired military veterans with child trauma recovery services. The Warriors to Guardians model had expanded to 17 states, with over 300 certified veteran guardians working in law enforcement, social services, and therapeutic settings across the country. Senators, when I returned from my 6th deployment to Afghanistan, I believed that my capacity for violence was the only valuable skill I possessed. Marcus testified, his voice carrying across the packed hearing room. I was wrong. What I actually possessed was a highly developed protective instinct and the tactical training to act effectively in crisis situations. The difference between destruction and protection isn't in the skills, it's in the mission. Senator Patricia Williams from Oregon, the subcommittee chair, leaned forward with interest. Mr. Thompson, can you quantify the impact your program has had on both veteran mental health outcomes and child safety metrics? The statistics Marcus presented were remarkable. Veterans who completed the Warriors to Guardian certification showed a 73% reduction in PTSD symptoms, a 68% decrease in substance abuse incidents, and a 91% success rate in finding stable, meaningful employment. Simultaneously, children served by veteran guardians showed accelerated trauma recovery, increased trust in authority figures, and significantly improved long-term psychological outcomes. But the numbers, impressive as they were, couldn't capture the human stories that had driven Marcus to this moment. Stories like former Army Ranger David Kim, who had transformed his sniper training into specialized skills for protecting children during court proceedings against their abusers, or former Navy SEAL Patricia Gonzalez, who used her underwater demolition expertise to develop water safety programs for kids who had survived near-drowning incidents during trafficking attempts. Each graduate represented a life reclaimed from the darkness of military trauma and redirected toward civilian protection missions that honored their service while serving society's most vulnerable members. The hearing was interrupted by news that would demonstrate the program's impact in real time. Senator Williams's aide approached the witness table with an urgent message. There was an active hostage situation at Roosevelt Middle School in Sacramento, and local authorities were requesting immediate assistance from the Warriors to Guardians Emergency Response Team. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and protective instinct as he absorbed the details. A former student had entered the school armed with multiple weapons, apparently seeking revenge against teachers he blamed for his academic failures. The situation was complicated by the fact that the perpetrator was only 16 years old technically, a child himself, despite the adult-level threat he represented. Senators, I need to return to Sacramento immediately, Marcus said, standing from the witness table. This is exactly the kind of situation our program was designed to address. Senator Williams gavelled a recess, but several committee members chose to accompany Marcus back to California, wanting to observe the Warriors to Guardians response in action. The flight to Sacramento was tense, with Marcus coordinating response protocols via secure communication with his team on the ground. The situation at Roosevelt Middle School was unlike anything the program had faced before. The perpetrator, 16-year-old Jason Mitchell, had barricaded himself in the school's main office with Principal Nancy Stevens and 2 administrative staff members. Mitchell had been expelled the previous month for repeated violent incidents and had returned, seeking what he called justice for his treatment. What made the situation particularly complex was Mitchell's own history of childhood trauma. He had been in and out of foster care, had experienced multiple forms of abuse, and showed clear signs of the same psychological damage that warriors to guardians, veterans were trained to recognize and address. Marcus arrived at the school to find his team already in position. Former Marine Captain Sarah Chun was coordinating with local SWAT teams, while retired Army medic Robert Martinez prepared trauma response protocols for the hostages. The response demonstrated the program's evolution from individual interventions to coordinated emergency operations. What's his psychological profile? Marcus asked Dr. Hayes, who had rushed to the scene to provide clinical support. Classic case of trauma-induced rage with a strong need for recognition and control, she replied, studying Mitchell's file. He's been victimized repeatedly throughout his childhood, and now he's trying to reclaim power through victimizing others. He's simultaneously perpetrator and victim. The paradox wasn't lost on Marcus. This was exactly the kind of complexity that traditional law enforcement struggled with: how to protect innocent people from someone who was themselves a victim of the same system that had failed to protect them. Marcus approached the school's main entrance alone, following the same protocols he had developed for trafficking raids and domestic violence situations. His size and military bearing made him an imposing figure, but his voice remained calm and non-threatening as he established communication with Mitchell. "Jason, my name is Marcus Thompson. I'm a veteran who works with kids who've been through difficult situations. I heard you're trying to get some people's attention, and I wanted to let you know that you've succeeded. Everyone is listening now." The response came through the intercom system Mitchell had apparently figured out how to operate. "I don't want to talk to cops. I want everyone to know what they did to me." Marcus recognized the desperate need for acknowledgement that often drove violent behavior in traumatized youth. Mitchell wasn't just seeking revenge, he was demanding that someone finally pay attention to his pain, validate his suffering, and hold accountable the systems that had failed him. "I'm not a cop, Jason. I'm someone who understands what it feels. Like when nobody listens, when the people who are supposed to help you make things worse instead. Tell me what happened." The conversation that followed revealed the extent of Mitchell's victimization. Abuse in multiple foster homes, bullying at school that went unaddressed by administration, a special education system that had labeled him as a problem rather than someone who needed help. Each failure had added another layer of trauma and rage, until violence seemed like the only language anyone would understand. "They said I was too stupid to learn, too damaged to fix," Mitchell said, his voice breaking with emotion. "So I figured I'd show them what damaged really looks like." Marcus understood that Mitchell's actions were a twisted form of communication, a desperate attempt to make visible the invisible pain he had carried for years. The boy was simultaneously crying out for help and punishing a world that had consistently failed to provide it. "You're not too damaged to fix, Jason," Marcus said firmly. "You're hurt, and you're angry, and you have every right to be both. But the people in that office aren't the ones who hurt you. They're just trying to do their jobs, probably trying to help other kids who feel the same way you do." The breakthrough came when Marcus shared his own story, not the sanitized version he gave to congressional committees, but the raw truth of his own journey from violence to protection. He described the killing he had done in Afghanistan, the guilt and rage that had consumed him afterward, the moment when he had chosen to use his strength to save rather than destroy. "I thought I was too broken to be anything but a weapon," Marcus continued. "But I learned that being broken doesn't mean you can't heal, And being hurt doesn't mean you have to hurt others. You get to choose who you become next. The negotiation lasted 4 hours, with Marcus gradually building trust while Mitchell processed emotions that had been suppressed for years. The conversation was punctuated by Mitchell's questions about the Warriors to Guardians program, about whether someone with his background could ever contribute positively to society, about whether forgiveness was possible for people who had done terrible things. "The kids I work with have been through things as bad as what you've experienced," Marcus said honestly. "Some of them thought they could never trust anyone again, never feel safe again, never amount to anything more than their worst experiences. But they learned that surviving trauma can make you stronger, not weaker. It can teach you to protect others who are going through what you went through." The surrender came peacefully, with Mitchell walking out of the office with his hands raised, his weapons left behind, his hostages unharmed but shaken. As he was taken into custody, Mitchell looked directly at Marcus with an expression that mixed desperation with the faintest hint of hope. "Do you really think someone like me could help other kids?" Mitchell asked. "I think someone like you is exactly who other kids need to see," Marcus replied. "Someone who understands their pain and chose to survive it." The incident at Roosevelt Middle School became a catalyst for expanding the Warriors to Guardians model beyond military veterans, to include other trauma survivors who could channel their experiences into protective service. The Second Chance Guardian pilot program began accepting applications from individuals with criminal records, histories of abuse, and other forms of marginalization, provided they met strict psychological evaluation criteria and committed to extensive training. Mitchell himself became the program's first non-veteran participant, spending his juvenile detention time in intensive therapy and education before beginning his Guardian training at age 18. His transformation from school shooter to youth advocate would become one of the program's most powerful examples of redemption and second chances. The congressional hearing reconvened 2 weeks later, with senators having witnessed firsthand how the Warriors to Guardians approach could address complex situations that traditional law enforcement struggled to handle effectively. The subcommittee voted unanimously to recommend federal funding for national expansion of the program. Standing before the senators again, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from the mountains of Afghanistan to the halls of Congress. The faces of those he had killed in combat would always be part of his story, but they no longer defined him. Instead, his legacy was being written by the children he had helped save, the veterans he had guided toward healing, and the programs he had created to transform trauma into service. "Senators, when I first came home from war, I believed that my experiences had broken me beyond repair," Marcus concluded his final testimony. "I was wrong. They had prepared me for the most important mission of my life, teaching others that our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of strength when we choose to use them in service of protection rather than destruction." Emma Rodriguez, now 21 and studying social work at UC Davis, sat in the gallery watching the man who had saved her life help save countless others. The scared 8-year-old who had first trusted a giant stranger in an alley had grown into a confident young woman whose own life's work would be dedicated to helping vulnerable children find safety and hope. After the hearing, as Marcus walked through the Capitol building surrounded by reporters and policymakers eager to discuss the future of veteran services and child protection, he carried in his pocket the same photograph that had traveled with him from Afghanistan, the picture of the Taliban fighter's family that had once represented his guilt and shame. Now, that photograph served a different purpose. It reminded him that every life lost in war had been someone's hope for the future, and that the best way to honor those losses was to dedicate his remaining years to giving hope back to those who needed it most. The ghosts of Afghanistan would always be with him, but they no longer haunted him. Instead, they served as witnesses to his transformation, silent testimony that redemption was possible for anyone willing to choose protection over destruction, service over self-destruction, love over violence, Marcus Thompson had found his answer to the question that had plagued him since returning from war. What was a soldier without a war? He was a guardian, a protector, a living bridge between the world of violence and the world of healing. He was someone who had learned that the capacity to take life could be transformed into the power to save it, and that the strongest people were often those who chose gentleness despite their ability to choose otherwise. The boy who had once killed men had become the man who dedicated his life to protecting children. It was a transformation that proved the most powerful truth of all, that no one is defined forever by their worst moments, and that every ending can become a new beginning if we have the courage to choose differently than we did before. 10 years had passed since Marcus Thompson first knelt in that Sacramento alley to help a frightened little girl, and the world had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The Warriors to Guardians program now operated in all 50 states, with over 2,000 certified guardian protectors serving in schools, hospitals, courts, and crisis response teams across America. But success on a national scale meant nothing compared to the letter Marcus held in his hands on this crisp December morning. The envelope bore Sophia Brennan's return address, postmarked from Stanford University, where she was completing her doctoral dissertation in clinical psychology. Inside, her handwriting had evolved from the careful lettering of a traumatized 11-year-old to the confident script of a woman preparing to dedicate her life to helping others heal from the same wounds she had overcome. Dear Marcus, the letter began. Today marks exactly 10 years since I first saw you in the Children's Center playroom. I was so broken then that I couldn't speak, couldn't trust, couldn't imagine a future beyond survival. You never tried to fix me with words, or force me to heal faster than I was ready. You simply existed in my space with such consistent gentleness that I eventually learned to believe in safety again. Marcus sat in his office at the National Warriors to Guardians Training Center, a converted military base in Colorado that had become the program's headquarters. Through his window, he could see the latest class of trainees conducting protective scenario exercises, their movements precise and purposeful as they learned to apply military tactics to civilian protection missions. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now worked at a former Army installation, but this time the mission was entirely different. Where soldiers had once learned to destroy, Guardians now learned to protect. Where weapons had been stored, there were now classrooms filled with trauma-informed care materials and child development resources. Sophia's letter continued. I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into the Pediatric Trauma Psychology Fellowship at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. My research focuses on something I call protective presence therapy, the idea that healing can happen simply through consistent exposure to strength that serves safety rather than harm. It's based entirely on what I learned from watching you work with frightened children. The concept that Sophia was now researching had emerged organically from Marcus's early experiments in trust building. He had never thought of his presence as therapeutic in itself, but child psychologists studying the Warriors to Guardians model had documented remarkable outcomes when traumatized children were simply allowed to observe protective adults in non-threatening environments. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Emma Rodriguez, now Dr. Emma Rodriguez, after completing her doctorate in social work at UC Berkeley. Turn on Channel 7 News, the message read. Jason's graduation ceremony is being broadcast live. Marcus switched on the television to see Jason Mitchell, the former Roosevelt Middle School shooter, walking across a stage in cap and gown to receive his bachelor's degree in education from Sacramento State University. The young man who had once terrorized a school was now preparing to become a teacher himself, specializing in working with at-risk youth who shared his background of trauma and abandonment. The news report highlighted Jason's journey through the Second Chance Guardian program, showing footage of him working with troubled teenagers at a residential facility outside Sacramento. In one clip, Jason sat cross-legged on the floor with a group of kids who could have been his younger self, angry, hurt, convinced that violence was their only language. But instead of reflecting their rage back at them, Jason offered something different, proof that transformation was possible. "I used to think that being damaged meant you had to damage others," Jason told the interviewer, his voice steady and thoughtful. "Marcus Thompson taught me that being broken can actually make you better at helping other broken people put themselves back together. Your worst experiences can become your greatest qualifications for understanding pain." The broadcast cut to an interview with Tyler, now 26, and working as a family court advocate for children in custody disputes. The little boy who had once hidden in bathroom stalls, terrorized by his own father's visits, had grown into a man whose life mission was ensuring that other children's voices were heard and protected during family crises. "Mr. Marcus saved my life in ways that can't be measured," Tyler said, his words carrying the weight of someone who had lived through hell and chosen to find meaning in survival. "Not just by keeping me safe when I was little, but by showing me that being small doesn't mean being powerless. Now I make sure judges understand what kids are really saying when they're too scared to speak clearly." Marcus turned off the television and returned to Sophia's letter, which had shifted to discussing her current research project, a longitudinal study tracking the life outcomes of children who had been helped by warriors to guardians protectors over the past decade. "The preliminary data is extraordinary," Sophia wrote. "Children who received guardian intervention show success rates in education, employment, and relationship stability that far exceed national averages for trauma survivors. But more importantly, they show dramatically lower rates of perpetrating violence themselves. It's as if exposure to protective strength breaks the cycle of trauma transmission." The concept of breaking generational trauma cycles had become central to the Warriors to Guardians philosophy. Marcus had learned that traumatized children who experienced protection from strong adults were significantly less likely to become perpetrators themselves as they aged. The presence of a guardian seemed to rewire their understanding of what strength could accomplish. His computer chimed with an incoming video call from Dr. Patricia Hayes, now in her 70s but still directing the Sacramento Children's Center. Her face appeared on screen, wrinkled but radiant with the satisfaction of someone who had dedicated her life to meaningful work. "Marcus, I have news that I wanted to share personally," Dr. Hayes said, her eyes bright with excitement. "The Department of Health and Human Services has approved our proposal for the National Child Protection Academy. We're going to train guardian protectors specifically for the child welfare system, embedding them in every major metropolitan area in the country." The proposal represented the culmination of a decade of research and advocacy. Instead of relying on overworked social workers and understaffed police departments to protect vulnerable children, the new system would deploy specially trained guardian protectors who combine military tactical skills with advanced child psychology training. "We estimate we can prevent approximately 40,000 cases of child abuse annually within the first 5 years," Dr. Hayes continued. "And the long-term societal benefits, reduced crime, improved educational outcomes, decreased mental health costs, could save taxpayers billions of dollars while transforming millions of lives." After ending the call, Marcus walked through the training center's halls, observing classes in session. In one room, former Navy SEALs learned to modify their voice patterns and body language to appear less threatening to small children. In another, ex-Marines practiced de-escalation techniques for domestic violence situations where children were present. The students represented every branch of military service and every type of combat experience. But they shared common threads: PTSD that had made civilian reintegration difficult, a deep-seated need for mission and purpose, and protective instincts that had been developed through years of training and combat deployment. Marcus paused outside a classroom where Sergeant First Class Maria Santos was teaching a module on tactical empathy, the ability to read emotional states. and threat levels in traumatized children with the same precision that soldiers applied to combat situations. Remember, your size and training can be either the most threatening or the most comforting presence in a child's life, Santos told her students. The difference isn't in what you are, it's in how you choose to use what you are. The lesson echoed the central philosophy that Marcus had developed through years of trial and error, that the same qualities that made someone an effective warrior could make them an extraordinary protector, provided they understood the fundamental difference between those missions. His afternoon was interrupted by an emergency call from the Los Angeles Police Department. A domestic violence situation had escalated to a barricaded suspect scenario, with a father holding his ex-wife and 2 young children hostage in their apartment. The man was reportedly a veteran suffering from untreated PTSD, and traditional negotiation attempts had failed. Marcus drove to Los Angeles, arriving at the scene to find familiar chaos, police vehicles, news crews, and a growing crowd of neighbors and onlookers, but this time he wasn't responding alone. 3 Warriors to Guardians graduates were already on scene, coordinating with LAPD's crisis negotiation team and preparing trauma response protocols for the children. The operation demonstrated how far the program had evolved from Marcus's early solo interventions. Former Army Ranger Jennifer Walsh was establishing communication with the suspect, while ex-Air Force pararescue specialist David Kim prepared medical support for potential victims. Meanwhile, retired Marine Captain Lisa Chun coordinated with Child Protective Services to ensure immediate placement options for the children once the situation was resolved. Marcus took his position as senior advisor, but he no longer needed to be the primary responder. His role had evolved from hands-on crisis intervention to strategic oversight and training, ensuring that the next generation of Guardian protectors could handle situations he might once have faced alone. The situation was resolved peacefully. After 6 hours of patient negotiation, with the veteran agreeing to surrender in exchange for guaranteed mental health treatment rather than imprisonment, the children emerged physically unharmed, but psychologically shaken, immediately surrounded by Guardian protectors, trained to provide comfort and stability during traumatic transitions. As Marcus watched his graduates work with professional efficiency and genuine compassion, he felt a profound sense of completion. The broken veteran who had once believed his only value lay in his capacity for violence had created something that would outlast his own life, a sustainable system for transforming warriors into guardians, ensuring that future generations of trauma survivors would have protectors who understood their pain. That evening, Marcus returned to his apartment in Colorado Springs, a modest space decorated with photographs and artwork from the children whose lives had intersected with his over the past decade. Emma's original drawing of their first meeting held the place of honor on his mantle, but it was surrounded by images that told the larger story: Sophia's doctoral graduation, Tyler's wedding, Jason's teaching certification, and dozens of other moments when broken people had chosen healing over harm. His phone rang with a call from Maria Rodriguez, who had become one of his closest friends and advisors as the Warriors to Guardians program expanded. Now married to a fellow social worker and mother to Emma and 2 younger children, Maria served on the program's National Advisory Board. "I saw the news coverage from LA today," Maria said. "Another perfect resolution. You should be proud of what you've built." Marcus considered her words carefully. Pride had always been a complicated emotion for him, tangled up with guilt over his military service and uncertainty about whether redemption was something he deserved or simply something he had been lucky enough to stumble upon. "I'm grateful," he said finally. "Grateful that something good came from all the bad. Grateful that other people were willing to trust a broken soldier with their children's safety. Grateful that transformation turned out to be possible." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at Marcus's door. He opened it to find a young woman in military fatigues, her posture rigid with the discipline of recent basic training, her eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare that Marcus recognized from his own mirror in those first months after returning home. "Are you Marcus Thompson?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "I am. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. I just returned from my second deployment to Syria. I heard about your program, and She paused, struggling with words that carried the weight of experiences she wasn't ready to articulate. "I think I need help figuring out what to do next." Marcus stepped aside to let her enter, recognizing in this young soldier the same lost desperation that had driven him to that construction job, to that evening walk that had led him to Emma's rescue, to the long journey that had brought him to this moment. "Tell me about your deployments," Marcus said, settling into his familiar role as listener and guide. As Lieutenant Mitchell began to share her story, the missions that had saved lives, the decisions that had taken them, the weight of responsibility that had followed her home. Marcus understood that his own transformation was complete, not because his journey had ended, but because it had become a pathway for others to follow. The faces of those he had killed in Afghanistan were still with him, would always be with him, but they no longer demanded penance. Instead, they served as reminders of the preciousness of life and the responsibility that came with the power to protect it. Every child he had helped save, every veteran he had guided toward healing, every guardian he had trained to serve protection instead of destruction, each represented a life affirmed rather than taken, a future preserved rather than ended. Marcus Thompson had learned the most important lesson a warrior could master, that true strength lay not in the capacity to destroy, but in the choice to protect. He had been a soldier who killed men, but he had become something far more powerful, a man who dedicated his life to ensuring that other soldiers would never have to carry that weight alone, and that the children of the world would always have guardians standing between them and the darkness. The war in Afghanistan had ended for America, but Marcus's war, the war against trauma, against cycles of violence, against the idea that broken people couldn't be healed, would continue for as long as there were children who needed protection and warriors who needed purpose. He was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, surrounded by the living proof that redemption was not only possible but replicable. The giant who had once cast shadows of fear now cast shadows of safety, and that transformation had become a light that would guide others home from their own darkest places. Conversation with Lieutenant Mitchell continued late into the night, but Marcus didn't mind. He had learned that healing happened one story at a time, one person at a time, one choice at a time. And he had the rest of his life to help others discover what he had learned in that alley 10 years ago, that the moment you choose to protect instead of harm is the moment you become who you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.